History is written by the victors. But what if everything you've been taught about America is only half the story? What if the voices of the enslaved, the workers, the women, and the Native Americans, the people who truly shaped this nation, were silenced for centuries? This is not the history in your textbooks. This is the history Howard Zinn dared to tell. Welcome to American Truths. Today we explore a people's history of the United States. From the untold struggles of the oppressed to the exploitation by the powerful, we uncover how ordinary people resisted injustice and fought to shape the America we live in today. What you are about to hear is history like you've never been taught before. Most of us were taught that history is about presidents, generals, and great men. The stories of the powerful, the victorious, and the famous dominate our textbooks. We memorize dates, battles, and laws, and we celebrate the leaders who supposedly shaped the nation. But what about the people who lived under their rule? What about the millions whose labor, suffering, and resistance made history possible yet left them invisible in the records? Howard Zinn, in his groundbreaking work, A People's History of the United States, challenges everything we think we know. He turns history upside down, showing us America not from the top but from the bottom, from the perspective of those whose voices were silenced, ignored, or erased. Consider the enslaved men and women who built the economic foundation of the colonies and the early United States. Their work fueled plantations, industries, and trade networks. Yet their experiences are often reduced to a few paragraphs in most history books. Zinn illuminates the daily lives of these people, their struggles, their rebellions, and the small victories they carved out in a system designed to strip them of agency. These are the true threads of American history, often hidden behind stories of generals and laws. But it wasn't only enslaved people whose stories were marginalized. Workers, from factory laborers to miners, faced extreme exploitation and danger. Child labor, brutal conditions, and wage theft were rampant. Yet these workers organized, protested, and sometimes rose up in revolt. The Homestead Strike, the Pullman Strike, and countless local uprisings show a persistent, courageous fight for dignity and fairness. Zinn argues that these struggles are as crucial to understanding American history as any battle won by an army or any law passed by Congress. Women, too, played an essential yet overlooked role. They fought for their rights, led movements, and contributed to revolutions, often without recognition. From organizing boycotts during the Revolutionary War to advocating for labor and suffrage, women shaped society, even when history denied them a place in its narrative. And we must not forget Native Americans. While textbooks often depict westward expansion as a tale of progress, Zinn presents the darker truth: displacement, cultural erasure, and violence inflicted on indigenous populations. Their resistance, their survival, and their efforts to protect their communities are integral to understanding the nation's formation. By telling history from the bottom up, Zinn exposes the contrast between the version recorded by the powerful and the lived realities of ordinary people. He invites us to ask, whose voices are missing from the story? Who benefits from the history we've been told? This approach is more than just an academic exercise. It forces us to rethink the foundations of American society, to recognize that the shaping of the nation was not solely in the hands of its leaders, but in the relentless struggles, sacrifices, and courage of the millions whose lives were marginalized. History from the bottom up is not just about what happened, it is about who lived it, who resisted it, and who survived it. It is about seeing the truth beyond the heroes in the textbooks, and understanding that the people, not just the powerful, have always been the true makers of history. When we think of slavery in America, our minds often jump to the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, and the legal abolition of slavery in 1865. Textbooks tell us a neat story. Enslaved people were freed, the nation healed, and progress marched forward. But Howard Zinn challenges this simplistic view. He reveals that the end of slavery was only the beginning of a long, ongoing struggle that would continue for generations under new forms of oppression and systemic inequality. Enslaved people were more than victims. They were active participants in shaping their own lives and fighting for freedom, even when the odds were stacked against them. Zinn shows us countless examples of resistance, work slowdowns, running away, revolts, and the preservation of culture and family under extreme duress. These acts of courage were not just reactions to immediate brutality, they were assertions of humanity and dignity in a society determined to deny them both. After the Civil War, slavery was legally abolished, but the social and economic structures that supported oppression did not vanish. Freedmen and women faced black codes, Jim Crow laws, sharecropping, and other systems designed to keep them in poverty and submission. They were technically free, but their freedom was constrained, policed, and undermined by the very society that claimed to champion liberty and equality. Zinn emphasizes that systemic racism did not begin with segregation, it evolved from centuries of exploitation and power imbalances. The plantation system did not vanish overnight. Its influence seeped into post-war economic practices, political control, and social hierarchies. African Americans were often forced into debt peonage, denied access to quality education, and excluded from political participation. The struggle for basic rights, from voting to owning property, became the defining challenge of Reconstruction and beyond. Resistance continued despite these obstacles. African Americans organized communities, founded schools, and created networks of mutual aid. They protested, litigated, and fought to assert their rights. Leaders like Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and later W.E.B. Du Bois worked tirelessly to challenge both legal and social oppression. Zinn shows that the story of slavery doesn't end with abolition. It extends into every act of defiance, every effort to claim humanity in the face of systemic suppression. The untold story of slavery is also a story about the complicity of American society. It is about how economic interests, political power, and cultural narratives worked to maintain racial hierarchies. It is about the fact that the legacy of slavery continues to shape social, economic, and political realities today. Wealth disparities, unequal education, and mass incarceration are not anomalies. They are part of a continuum that began with slavery and adapted to survive the formal end of the institution. By examining slavery not as a closed chapter but as a persistent force in American life, Zinn forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. He challenges the glorified, sanitized version of history and asks us to see the ongoing impact of centuries of oppression. The struggle for true freedom and equality was never fully won. It continues in the lives of those who resist, who organize, and who demand justice, even today. The untold story of slavery, then, is not just a story of oppression, it is a story of resilience, courage, and resistance. It is a reminder that freedom is never simply given. It is fought for, every day, by those whose voices history often tries to erase. When we think of American history, we often imagine pioneers, settlers, and the brave expansion westward. Textbooks celebrate the idea of manifest destiny, progress, and nation building. But Howard Zinn reminds us that this story has a dark, often ignored side. The colonization of America was not just about settlement, it was about genocide, land theft, and the systematic destruction of entire cultures. Native Americans were the first victims of European colonization, long before the United States became a nation. They had rich societies, complex governance, and thriving cultures. Yet, from the moment Europeans arrived, they faced disease, displacement, and violent conquest. Zinn exposes how these early actions set a precedent. The lives, lands, and autonomy of indigenous people were considered expendable in the pursuit of wealth, power, and expansion. Land theft was central to this tragedy. From the earliest colonies to the vast western territories, Native Americans were forcibly removed from their ancestral lands. Treaties, often signed under duress or dishonestly, were routinely broken. The Trail of Tears stands as one of the most infamous examples of government-mandated relocation of thousands of Cherokee people, resulting in immense suffering and death. These were not isolated incidents. They were part of a systematic pattern repeated across the continent. Zinn emphasizes that this destruction was not only physical but cultural. Native American languages, traditions, and spiritual practices were actively suppressed. Children were sent to boarding schools where speaking their native tongue was forbidden, and cultural practices were labeled as barbaric or backward. This erasure was intended to weaken indigenous identity and force assimilation into a Euro-American model of society. Violence was a constant companion. Military campaigns against native nations were brutal and unrelenting. Tribes like the Lakota, Apache, and Navajo faced relentless attacks from U.S. forces, often under the guise of protecting settlers or civilizing the frontier. Entire communities were decimated. Zinn's work highlights how these actions were not accidents of war. They were deliberate policies designed to remove obstacles to expansion and exploit the land for economic gain. Economic exploitation followed land theft. Native Americans were often forced onto reservations, stripped of resources, and left to survive in harsh conditions while settlers and corporations profited from the fertile lands, timber, and mineral wealth they had seized. This systemic exploitation mirrors, in some ways, the economic structures imposed on enslaved African Americans: wealth and power for a few, suffering for the many. The consequences of this forgotten tragedy extend into modern America. Indigenous communities continue to face poverty, marginalization, and systemic neglect. Many reservations struggle with inadequate housing, limited education, and lack of access to healthcare. Zinn connects these contemporary realities to historical policies, showing that the price paid by Native Americans for America's progress wasn't still as enormous. By highlighting the experiences of Native Americans, Zinn shifts our understanding of American history. He asks us to confront uncomfortable truths, that the nation's growth was built on the suffering of entire peoples, and that the idea of progress is often meant oppression. This chapter of history is essential not only to honor the victims, but to understand the foundations of inequality and injustice that persist today. Native Americans' forgotten tragedy is a story of survival amidst devastation, resistance amidst destruction, and resilience in the face of relentless oppression. It is a history that forces us to question the very narrative of American greatness, and to recognize the human costs behind the nation's expansion. Throughout American history, a recurring pattern emerges. the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few, often at the expense of ordinary people. Howard Zinn draws our attention to this enduring reality, showing that from the days of southern plantations to the rise of industrial factories, economic exploitation has been a constant, shaping society in ways that continue to resonate today. In the antebellum South, the plantation system was the backbone of the economy. A small number of wealthy landowners controlled vast tracts of land and hundreds of enslaved people. Their wealth was built on forced labor, coercion, and systemic inequality. Ordinary people, both enslaved and poor whites, were kept dependent and powerless with little opportunity to challenge the system. Zinn emphasizes that this was not merely a southern problem. It was a reflection of how concentrated economic power can dictate social and political life. As the nation moved into the industrial age, the locus of economic exploitation shifted but did not disappear. Factories, railroads, and mines replaced plantations as centers of wealth accumulation, and industrial magnates rose to unprecedented power. Figures like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and J.P. Morgan controlled industries essential to daily life: steel, oil, and finance. Their fortunes dwarfed the wealth of even the richest plantation owners of the past. Yet the methods they used mirrored those of the plantation elites, controlling labor, manipulating markets, and influencing government policies to preserve and expand their advantage. Workers in these new industries often faced grueling conditions: long hours, low pay, and dangerous environments. Efforts to organize and demand fair treatment through strikes and unionization were frequently met with violent suppression. The Homestead Strike of 1892, where steel workers were attacked by Pinkerton agents, and the Pullman Strike of 1894, which saw federal troops called in against striking workers, exemplify how economic power was enforced through force, echoing the coercion of the plantation system. Zinn also highlights the role of government and law in perpetuating inequality. Corporate influence extended into politics and the legal system. Laws were shaped to protect the interests of the wealthy, while the rights of workers in marginalized communities were systematically undermined. The reinterpretation of the 14th Amendment to grant corporations the same protections as individuals is a striking example of this structural bias, ensuring that the powerful could operate with impunity. Beyond labor, economic exploitation took cultural and social forms. Narratives of self-reliance and individual success were promoted to mask systemic inequality. Stories of rags to riches encouraged the belief that anyone could succeed if they tried hard enough, conveniently ignoring the structural barriers faced by the majority. Zinn shows how these narratives deflected attention from the concentration of wealth and the ongoing oppression of ordinary people. Importantly, Zinn's analysis underscores that economic exploitation is not just a relic of the past. Patterns established during the plantation and industrial eras persist today in the form of income inequality, limited access to education, and political systems heavily influenced by money. The same dynamics that allowed a few to control the labor and lives of many continue to shape modern society. By tracing the history of economic exploitation from plantations to factories, Zinn forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Inequality is not accidental, it is deliberate. Understanding this continuity is essential for recognizing the structures that maintain power and for imagining a society that truly values fairness and justice. Economic exploitation, Zinn argues, is not just a historical problem, it is an ongoing challenge that shapes the lives of millions every day. American history textbooks often celebrate innovation, industrial growth, and the rise of the modern economy. But Howard Zinn urges us to look beyond the glossy narrative of progress and consider the human cost behind it. The story of ordinary workers, men, women, and immigrants fighting for fair wages and humane working conditions is a crucial chapter that is often ignored. These struggles reveal the systemic inequalities that shape the nation and the lengths to which the powerful would go to maintain control. The late 19th century, known as the Gilded Age, was a period of unprecedented industrial expansion. Factories, railroads, and mines offered employment, but the conditions were harsh and often deadly. Workers endured 12 to 16-hour days, 6 or 7 days a week, with minimal pay and little protection. Safety regulations were nearly non-existent, and injuries or death on the job were considered part of the cost of doing business. Zinn highlights that this exploitation was not accidental. It was a deliberate strategy to maximize profits and maintain the economic dominance of the wealthy elite. Labor uprisings became inevitable. Workers organized strikes to demand better pay, reasonable hours, and safer conditions. But these protests were met with brutal resistance. The Homestead Strike of 1892 stands as a stark example. Steelworkers at Andrew Carnegie's Homestead Steelworks protested wage cuts and deteriorating working conditions. In response, Carnegie's company hired armed Pinkerton agents to break the strike. A violent clash ensued, leaving multiple people dead and many injured. The strike was ultimately crushed, but it exposed the lengths to which industrialists would go to maintain control and suppress worker rights. Similarly, the Pullman Strike of 1894, involving railroad workers, demonstrated the power of both corporations and the federal government in quelling labor unrest. When workers protested wage cuts and high rents in company-owned housing, the strike escalated nationwide. President Grover Cleveland sent federal troops to intervene, resulting in violent confrontations and numerous deaths. Zinn emphasizes that these events were not isolated incidents. They were part of a systematic effort to prevent workers from challenging the existing power structures. Zinn's analysis goes further, showing that these struggles were about more than just wages. They were about dignity, fairness, and the right of ordinary people to have a voice in the system that governed their lives. The violent suppression of strikes illustrated a stark reality. Economic and political power was concentrated in the hands of a few, and the state often acted in defense of elite interests rather than the common good. What makes these stories particularly significant is that they reveal the continuity of exploitation from slavery to industrial capitalism. Just as enslaved people had to fight for basic human rights, industrial workers had to struggle for fair treatment in a system designed to maximize profit at their expense. The lessons are clear. Social change rarely comes from the top down. It is often the result of persistent, collective action by those who are marginalized and oppressed. By revisiting these labor uprisings, Zinn challenges the sanitized versions of history that dominate classrooms. He urges us to recognize the courage of ordinary people who risked their lives to assert their rights and to see the systemic patterns of inequality that persist today. Workers' struggles and rebellions are not just historical events, they are reminders that the fight for justice is ongoing, and that the voices of the oppressed must never be forgotten. When most Americans think of war, we imagine noble causes, freedom, democracy, and the defense of liberty. History books often frame American conflicts as battles fought for justice and moral righteousness, but Howard Zinn urges us to look closer to question the official narrative, and to consider the interests that truly drove these wars. According to Zinn, many American wars were fought not purely for freedom, but for economic advantage, political power, and the protection of elite interests. Take the expansionist wars of the 19th century, for example. The Mexican-American War of 1846-1848 is often depicted as a heroic struggle that expanded the United States. Yet Zinn points out that the war was fueled by the desire of wealthy landowners and industrialists to acquire territory, control resources, and extend systems of economic dominance. Ordinary soldiers fought and died, believing they were defending democracy, while the economic and political elite secured new lands and wealth. Similarly, the Spanish-American War of 1898, framed as a fight to liberate Cuba from Spanish rule, had clear economic motives. American business interests sought access to sugar, tobacco, and emerging markets in the Caribbean and Asia. Political leaders capitalized on nationalist sentiment, while corporations gained influence and profit from the resulting territorial acquisitions. Zinn emphasizes that these patterns are not anomalies, they reflect a broader trend of conflating national interest with elite economic and political gain. Even in conflicts like World War I, the official narrative of fighting for democracy obscured the influence of American financial institutions and industrial leaders, who profited enormously from war production and international loans. Zinn argues that ordinary citizens were often the ones to bear the cost, losing their lives and livelihoods while powerful interests consolidated wealth and political influence. Zinn also questions the glorification of World War II, not to diminish the human sacrifice involved, but to highlight how economic and strategic interests shaped the U.S. involvement. Military-industrial expansion, access to global markets, and the projection of American power played key roles alongside the fight against fascism. By examining these factors, Zinn encourages us to understand that wars are rarely fought purely for moral ideals. They are intertwined with the pursuit of profit, influence, and control. These insights challenge the traditional portrayal of American history as a series of heroic battles for justice. Zinn reminds us that history is written by the victors, often leaving out inconvenient truths about who really benefits from war. Soldiers and civilians suffer the consequences, while elites and corporations often reap the rewards. The glorification of patriotism and sacrifice masks systemic exploitation and manipulation, allowing wars to serve the interests of a few rather than the many. By critically examining these conflicts, Zinn urges us to rethink our understanding of patriotism and justice. He asks us to question why wars occur, who profits, and how power shapes the narrative. Through this lens, American history is not just a story of victories and moral triumphs. It is also a story of economic and political calculation, where ordinary people are called to fight, and the powerful often emerge with greater advantage. Understanding wars through this perspective is essential for grasping the ongoing patterns of inequality and exploitation in American society. Zinn teaches that by analyzing the true interests behind conflicts, we gain a clearer understanding of the forces shaping our past and present, and we become better equipped to question official histories that glorify power at the expense of justice. When we think of the civil rights movement, Our minds often go to the 1960s images of Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and the March on Washington dominate textbooks and popular culture. But Howard Zinn reminds us that the struggle for racial equality in America did not begin in the 1960s. It is a story centuries in the making, carried forward by ordinary people whose courage and persistence laid the foundation for the well-known victories of the mid-20th century. Zinn traces this struggle back to the earliest days of the United States, when enslaved African Americans resisted oppression through both subtle and overt acts. Rebellions like those led by Nat Turner in 1831 challenged the brutal institution of slavery and sent shockwaves through the American South. While these uprisings were violently suppressed, they revealed a persistent desire for freedom and justice among those who were systematically denied basic human rights. Even after the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, the fight for equality continued. Reconstruction offered hope, as amendments to the Constitution promised citizenship and voting rights for formerly enslaved people. Yet Zinn emphasizes that these victories were fragile. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan used terror and intimidation to undermine progress, and the eventual compromise that ended Reconstruction left African Americans vulnerable to decades of disenfranchisement under Jim Crow laws. Resistance did not end, however. African Americans, often at great personal risk, organized to defend their communities and demand justice. Grassroots activism, local boycotts, legal challenges, and community education became essential tools in the ongoing struggle. Figures like Ida B. Wells used journalism to expose lynching and racial violence, proving that ordinary citizens could wield influence even in the face of overwhelming oppression. Zinn also highlights the role of women in these early movements. Black women, often invisible in traditional narratives, led campaigns for education, and civil rights. Their activism ensured that the fight for equality encompassed not only legal rights, but also social and economic justice, planting seeds for the broader movement that would gain national attention decades later. These centuries of resistance were not isolated events. They created networks, strategies, and ideas that would shape the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Zinn argues that the narrative of a sudden, heroic struggle led by a few iconic figures obscures the deep roots of activism and the collective efforts of ordinary people. Understanding this history is essential to grasping the continuity of struggle and the resilience of marginalized communities. By examining civil rights before the headlines, Zinn teaches viewers to recognize that progress is rarely linear. It is the result of sustained effort, persistence, and courage in the face of systemic oppression. Ordinary people, often overlooked in mainstream accounts, were the backbone of a centuries-long fight for justice, creating the foundation for the monumental changes of the 20th century. This perspective challenges the conventional story, reminding us that the fight for civil rights was, and remains, a collective endeavor. It underscores the importance of grassroots activism and the power of ordinary citizens to effect meaningful change, even when history seems stacked against them. In tracing these hidden stories, Zinn ensures that the heroes of the early civil rights struggle are never forgotten, and that their lessons continue to inspire generations seeking justice today. When we read traditional history, women often appear as background figures, passive, silent, and peripheral. Textbooks focus on presidents, generals, and political leaders, giving little attention to the countless women whose contributions shaped the course of society. Howard Zinn challenges this narrative, emphasizing that women were not just witnesses to history, they were active participants, organizers, and agents of change, often in the face of enormous social, legal, and economic barriers. From the era of the American Revolution, women played critical roles both on the home front and in the public sphere. They managed households in the absence of men, sustained local economies, and even participated in boycotts, protests, and support networks for revolutionary causes. Figures like Abigail Adams, who famously urged her husband to remember the ladies, highlight the early awareness among women of their marginalization and the need to claim a voice in shaping society. But the revolutionary era was only the beginning. As the nation grew, women organized around issues of education, abolition, and temperance, understanding that social progress required persistent activism. Zinn points out that many women were at the forefront of abolitionist movements, advocating for the freedom of enslaved people while simultaneously fighting for their own rights. Activists like Sojourner Truth and Lucretia Mott demonstrated that the struggle for racial justice and gender equality were often intertwined, revealing the deep connections between oppression and the fight for liberation. The 19th and early 20th centuries saw women spearheading labor movements, addressing economic inequality, and demanding fair working conditions. They organized strikes, unions, and mutual aid societies, often risking arrests and violence. Women in factories, textile mills, and garment shops not only worked long hours for minimal pay, but also led campaigns for wage increases, shorter workdays, and safer conditions. Zinn emphasizes that these struggles are rarely included in mainstream histories, yet they were instrumental in shaping labor laws and workers' rights. Beyond labor, women played central roles in education, healthcare, and social reform. They founded schools, hospitals, and charitable organizations, often filling gaps left by a male-dominated political system. Their work laid the groundwork for modern social services and public welfare systems, illustrating how societal change often emerges from the persistent efforts of ordinary citizens rather than political elites. Zinn also critiques the erasure of women from historical narratives. By focusing almost exclusively on men in positions of power, traditional histories obscure the networks, strategies, and movements led by women that brought about profound societal transformation. This erasure reinforces gender hierarchies, perpetuating the myth that women were passive observers rather than active shapers of history. By examining women's roles across centuries from revolutionary activism to labor movements and social reforms, it encourages viewers to recognize the full spectrum of historical agency. Ordinary women, working quietly but persistently, challenged injustice, advocated for rights, and reshaped their communities, often without recognition. Their struggles were essential to the progress that later generations would celebrate. Understanding the hidden contributions of women changes our perception of history. It reveals a richer, more complex narrative in which power is contested not just by elites, but by ordinary people who refuse to remain silent. Through Zinn's lens, we see that history is not only the story of men in leadership positions, it is also the story of women who fought tirelessly, often invisibly, to create a fairer, more just society. Recognizing their efforts is not just a matter of historical accuracy, it is a necessary step in understanding the true dynamics of power and resistance in America. History is often told as the story of kings, presidents, generals, and the powerful elite. But Howard Zinn turns his perspective on its head, showing us that real change rarely comes from those at the top. Instead, it comes from ordinary people, workers, farmers, students, women, men, and entire communities who challenge the structures of power through courage, persistence, and collective action. From the earliest days of the United States, ordinary citizens have stood up against concentrated power. The American Revolution itself was not solely the achievement of political leaders. It was fueled by the participation of everyday people resisting taxation without representation, forming militias and sustaining boycotts. Zinn emphasizes that this spirit of resistance, ordinary people asserting their rights against entrenched authority, recurs throughout history. In the 19th century, we see countless examples of this dynamic. Workers organized strikes and unions to demand fair wages, safer working conditions, and shorter hours. Women and men fought together in labor movements, risking imprisonment and physical harm, often facing brutal suppression by private security forces and government troops. The Homestead Strike of 1892 and the Pullman Strike of 1894 illustrate a stark reality. When ordinary people rise to challenge the wealthy elite, the response is often violent, yet the courage displayed plants seeds for long-term social and political change. Zinn highlights that protests, rebellions, and grassroots movements are more than just isolated events. They are part of a continuum where ordinary people continuously push back against oppression, whether it was African Americans resisting slavery, Native Americans defending their lands, immigrants striking for justice, or women advocating for suffrage. These movements demonstrate that power is never absolute. It is contested, negotiated, and at times overturned by collective action from the bottom up. This perspective also challenges the glorification of political elites in traditional histories. Laws, policies, and institutional structures often reflect the interests of those with wealth and influence. Yet Zinn reminds us that when citizens organize, protest, and persist, they can disrupt these structures. Social reforms, labor protections, civil rights legislation, all of these came about because ordinary people demanded them, sometimes against overwhelming odds. Even in modern times, the theme of people versus power persists. Grassroots movements, from civil rights marches to environmental activism, demonstrate the enduring power of collective action. Ordinary individuals, when united around a cause, can challenge entrenched systems, influence public opinion, and drive legislative or social change. Zinn underscores that this is not new, it is a repeating thread throughout American history, linking the struggles of the past with those of the present. The lesson is clear. History is not solely the domain of the powerful. It is shaped, often decisively, by those who refuse to accept injustice and who organize to confront the elite structures of their time. When we understand history through this lens, we begin to see patterns of resistance, courage, and innovation that traditional narratives overlook. We realize that ordinary people, collectively, can shape the course of nations. Howard Zinn's focus on people versus power invites us to reconsider our assumptions about authority, change, and justice. It shows that ordinary citizens are not passive observers, they are active participants capable of challenging, disrupting, and transforming societies. And in this recognition, we find both a clearer understanding of the past and inspiration for engaging with the struggles of today. When we think of history, we often imagine an objective account of past events and neutral record of what happened. Howard Zinn challenges this notion, insisting that history is never neutral. Every story we are taught reflects the interests, perspectives, and biases of those who write it. The official version of history is crafted not just to inform but often to justify, glorify, or conceal. And in understanding this, we begin to see history not as a fixed truth, but as a contested narrative. From the earliest days of the United States, historical narratives were shaped by those in power. Textbooks highlighted the deeds of presidents, generals, and wealthy elites, while largely ignoring the voices of the enslaved, the working poor, women, and indigenous peoples. By prioritizing the perspectives of the powerful, history textbooks created a simplified story, one that celebrated victories and glossed over oppression, inequality, and resistance. Zinn emphasizes that every historical account is influenced by context and interest. For instance, the narrative of the American Revolution often celebrates founding fathers as heroic visionaries, yet it frequently omits the stories of ordinary people who risked their lives in malicious, endured economic hardships, and challenged social hierarchies. The contributions of African Americans, Native Americans, women, and laborers are marginalized, leaving a history that feels complete but is, in fact, selective. The Civil War, too, is an example. Traditional histories focus on battlefield strategies, the leadership of generals, and Lincoln's political genius. What is often excluded is the lived experience of enslaved people, who not only survived unimaginable oppression but actively resisted, escaped, and helped to dismantle the institution of slavery. Zinn's work reminds us that these voices matter, that they provide a fuller, richer understanding of the past. Understanding that history is never neutral is not just an academic exercise, it changes how we interpret current events. Modern social, political, and economic structures are built on historical narratives that favor the powerful. Laws, policies, and societal norms are often justified by selective histories that obscure inconvenient truths. By questioning the official accounts, we can uncover patterns of inequality, injustice, and resistance that continue to shape the world today. Zinn encourages us to read critically, to ask who benefits from the story being told, and to seek out the marginalized perspectives that have been excluded. History is a dialogue, not a monologue. It is composed of multiple voices, some loud and dominant, others quiet and suppressed. The task of understanding history fully is to listen to all of them, to piece together a narrative that is honest about both oppression and resistance. In doing so, we gain more than knowledge of the past, we gain insight into power itself. Recognizing that history is never neutral allows us to see that the shaping of collective memory is a political act. Those who control the narrative can influence perception, culture, and even policy. But by examining the stories that have been hidden, ignored, or misrepresented, ordinary people gain the tools to challenge power, demand justice, and participate in shaping their own society. Howard Zinn's lesson is clear. Never accept the official version at face value. Question, investigate, and seek the voices that have been silenced. History is a living conversation, and it is our responsibility to engage with it critically. Only then can we truly understand the past, recognize the forces shaping the present, and imagine a more just future.